the periscope broke the surface for exactly 3 seconds. Commander Richard O'Kane counted them silently, his eye pressed against the rubber eyepiece, watching the massive grey hull of a Japanese aircraft carrier slide across his field of vision. 1,200 yards away. Close enough to read the hull numbers if the light had been better. Close enough that if anyone on that flight deck looked in the right direction at the right moment, they'd see the thin metal tube cutting through the water like a shark's fin. 3 seconds. Then down. O'Kane slapped the handles up and stepped back as the periscope hissed into its well. Around him in USS Tang's conning tower, 5 men stood frozen at their stations, waiting for the depth charges they all knew were coming. The carrier's destroyer escorts would have seen that periscope. They always did. The water around Tang would erupt in crushing explosions any second now, but the seconds passed. 5, 10, 20, no explosions, no destroyer, screws accelerating toward them. Nothing but the ambient noise of the ocean and Tang's electric motors pushing them slowly through the water at 150 feet below the surface. O'Kane's executive officer, Frank Springer, broke the silence with a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow alert the Japanese above them. "They didn't see us, Skipper. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today." O'Kane nodded slowly, his mind already working through the geometry of what he'd just witnessed. The carrier was on a steady course, making turns for maybe 18 knots. 2 destroyers, in close escort, 1 ahead, 1 astern. A cruiser visible in the distance, probably screening the formation's flank. This was the Japanese first carrier strike force, or what remained of it after 2 years of American submarines and aircraft, had steadily whittled down the Emperor's naval aviation capability. And they'd just sailed directly over USS Tang without detecting her presence. The date was June 17, 1944, and the war in the Pacific had reached a critical phase. American forces were preparing to invade the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan, an operation that would bring B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands for the first time. The Japanese knew this. They knew that losing the Marianas meant losing the war's strategic initiative permanently, so they'd committed their remaining carrier strength to stopping the invasion. 4 carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, steaming east from their bases in the Philippines to engage the American invasion fleet. Naval intelligence had been tracking them for days, and every available American submarine had been positioned along their expected route. Tang was one of 8 boats forming a picket line west of the Marianas, tasked with reporting enemy movements and attacking if opportunities presented themselves. O'Kane had been tracking this particular carrier group since dawn, staying deep during daylight, hours, surfacing briefly after dark to charge batteries and transmit contact reports to fleet headquarters. Standard submarine procedure, nothing remarkable about it, except for one detail that O'Kane had noticed during his last periscope observation just before sunrise. The Japanese weren't zigzagging. Every carrier formation O'Kane had encountered in 2 years of Pacific combat followed evasive patterns, irregular course changes designed to prevent submarines from establishing predictable firing solutions. The geometry was simple. A submarine needed to know where a target would be 30 or 40 seconds in the future, the time it took torpedoes to reach their aim point. Zigzagging made that calculation nearly impossible, unless you got lucky and fired just after a course change, catching the target on a steady heading. But this formation was steaming straight as an arrow, maintaining course and speed like they owned the ocean and weren't worried about submarines. That arrogance was about to cost them everything. The question occupying O'Kane's mind wasn't whether to attack. That decision had been made the moment he'd identified the carrier's silhouette through the periscope. The question was how to attack without getting Tang killed in the process. Traditional submarine doctrine called for submerged approaches from the target's beam, firing torpedoes at 90-degree angles, where the range calculation was simplest and the target's profile largest. You'd set up your approach, close to firing range, take a final periscope observation to confirm your solution, then fire a spread of 4 or 6 torpedoes and dive deep to evade the inevitable counterattack. The problem with traditional doctrine was that it required multiple periscope observations during the approach. Each observation increased detection risk exponentially. Japanese destroyer escorts had gotten very good at spotting periscopes, and once they spotted you, your attack was over. You'd spend the next several hours evading depth charges instead of shooting torpedoes. O'Kane had been thinking about this problem since his executive officer days aboard USS WWII under Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton. Morton had taught him that aggressive tactics beat cautious tactics, that getting close to targets increased hit probability dramatically, that surface attacks at night could devastate convoys. But Morton had also been killed 6 months earlier when WWII was caught by Japanese aircraft in the La Perouse Strait and depth charged until her hull imploded. Aggression without calculation was suicide. Calculated aggression with innovative tactics was how you survived long enough to matter. O'Kane's innovation was deceptively simple. Instead of making multiple periscope observations during the approach, he'd make exactly one. A single 3-second look at the optimal moment, gathering every piece of information needed for the attack, then conducting the entire final approach blind, using mathematics and dead reckoning instead of visual confirmation. The technique required absolute confidence in your navigation, perfect knowledge of your submarine's capabilities, and crew members who could execute complex maneuvers without visual reference to targets. It also required accepting that you might miss completely if any variable in your calculation was wrong. But the payoff was enormous. One brief periscope exposure versus the traditional 6 or 8 observations dramatically reduced detection probability. The ability to attack high-value targets that traditional approaches couldn't reach because their escorts were too alert. O'Kane called it single observation firing. His crew had a different name for it. They called it the skipper's stupid periscope trick, spoken with the mixture of pride and terror that submariners reserved for tactics that were simultaneously brilliant and insane. The technique had worked twice before on Tang's current patrol. A freighter sunk off Bonin Islands using a single periscope look from 4,000 yards. A tanker destroyed near the Palau Islands with one quick observation followed by a 20-minute blind approach. But those had been merchant vessels with minimal escorts, targets that didn't shoot back effectively. A carrier with destroyer escorts was different. Miss with your torpedoes, and those destroyers would hunt Tang until they either sank her or exhausted their depth charge loadouts. There wouldn't be a second chance. O'Kane moved to the plotting table, where his fire control coordinator, Lieutenant Murray Frazee, was maintaining their dead reckoning position. The chart showed Tang's estimated location, the carrier's last observed position and heading, and the geometry of a firing solution that existed only in calculations, not visual confirmation. Murray, what's our range to target if they've maintained course and speed? Frazee worked his slide rule for 10 seconds, cross-checking against the stopwatch. He'd started when the periscope went down. 1,100 yards, skipper. Closing at combined speed of 8 knots. We'll be at optimal firing range in 6 minutes. 6 minutes to cover the remaining distance to where O'Kane wanted to shoot from. 6 minutes during which the carrier might turn, might increase speed, might do anything that would invalidate every calculation they'd made. But 6 minutes was also short enough that major course changes were unlikely. Carriers didn't maneuver aggressively in open ocean unless they were launching or recovering aircraft, and O'Kane had seen no flight operations during his 3-second observation. Depth? 150 feet, sir. Bubble at 3 degrees down. Perfect. Tang was trimmed slightly nose down, giving them the ability to increase depth quickly if depth charges started falling. The Mark 18 electric torpedoes in the forward tubes were set to run at 10 feet below the surface, shallow enough to hit a carrier below the seatoes, waterline where the hull was thinnest, deep enough to avoid the wake turbulence that could throw torpedoes off course. O'Kane studied the plot, visualizing the attack geometry in 3 dimensions. Tang was approaching from slightly abaft the carrier's beam, an angle that gave them a reasonable shot at the vulnerable midships section while keeping the range manageable. The destroyers were the wild cards. One ahead of the carrier, one astern, both probably running sonar sweeps, but hampered by the carrier's noise drowning out subtler sounds. If Tang stayed quiet, moved slowly, kept her depth steady to avoid unnecessary noise from trim pump operations, she might stay undetected until the torpedoes were in the water. After that, it didn't matter. Once you fired, everyone knew where you were. The question was whether your torpedoes reached the target before the escorts reached you. "Stand by, forward tubes, 1 through 6, O'Kane ordered, his voice carrying the calm certainty his crew needed to hear. "We'll fire on a 90-degree track angle, 6-second intervals between shots. Murray, I want a spread that covers 50 yards of target length. If they maneuver during the torpedo run, I want at least 2 fish to stay on intercept." "Aye, sir. Spread calculated for 300 yards target length, 50-yard coverage." The minutes ticked past. In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 18 torpedoes sat in their tubes, warheads armed, gyro angles set, depth settings locked. Each torpedo weighed over 3,000 pounds and carried 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, enough to crack a carrier's keel if it hit in the right place. The men in the torpedo room stood ready at the firing panel, hands on the firing levers, waiting for the command that would send those weapons toward a target they couldn't see, guided by calculations made by officers. They trusted, because trust was all you had, 300 feet underwater, with enemy destroyers overhead. At 100 yards from the calculated firing point, O'Kane made his decision. "Up, Periscope. Quick look. 3 seconds maximum." The periscope hissed up. O'Kane caught it halfway, riding it up as the optics broke the surface. His eye found the carrier immediately, trained by hundreds of previous observations to locate targets instantly. The massive flight deck filled his view, range 800 yards, almost exactly where Murray's calculations said it would be. Bearing matched the plot, speed unchanged. The carrier was still steaming straight and steady, completely unaware that an American submarine was about to put 6 torpedoes into her hull. 2 seconds. O'Kane's mind catalogued everything visible. The destroyer ahead had increased distance from the carrier slightly, opening the formation. The stern destroyer was barely visible, probably conducting a sonar sweep away from the formation. No aircraft on deck. No apparent flight operations planned. The carrier's island structure showed minimal personnel, suggesting routine steaming rather than combat alert status. 3 seconds. Downscope. Angle on the bow is 7 to 5 degrees port. Mark bearing 280. Range 800 yards. "She's all ours, gentlemen." The periscope dropped. O'Kane stepped to the target data computer, that mechanical marvel of gears and cams that translated observations into firing solutions. He fed in the updated information, watching the solution dials settle on firing parameters that matched Murray's calculations almost perfectly. When your dead reckoning and visual observations agreed within 50 yards at combat ranges, you knew your navigation was solid. Solution set. Check bearing. Bearing 280 confirmed, skipper. Final bearing and shoot. Stand by tubes 1 through 6. This was the moment where traditional doctrine said you took one more periscope observation, confirmed the target was still where you expected, then fired. But that observation would give the destroyers one more chance to spot you. O'Kane had seen what he needed to see. The mathematics were solid. The carrier was where she should be, doing what she'd been doing for the past hour. Time to commit. Fire one. The submarine shuddered slightly as compressed air ejected the first torpedo from its tube. A hiss of displaced water, a slight change in trim as 3,000 pounds left the boat. The reload crew was already moving, preparing to load another torpedo into the now empty tube, though they wouldn't complete that process before this attack ended one way or another. One fired electrically, running normally, the torpedo officer reported. Fire 2. Enough time for the first torpedo to clear the firing solution before the second launched. The spread O'Kane had calculated would place 6 torpedoes across the carrier's midships section, spaced to ensure at least several hits even if the target maneuvered during the torpedo runtime. 2 fired, electrically, running normally. Fire 3. Each torpedo accelerated to 46 knots once clear of the tube, their electric motors leaving no visible wake like older steam-powered models did. That invisibility was both advantage and disadvantage. Japanese lookouts wouldn't see the torpedo wakes approaching, giving them no advance warning. But O'Kane's crew also couldn't visually track the weapons to confirm they were running properly. 3 fired electrically, running normally. Fire 4. The Mark 18 had proven reliable in combat, unlike the Mark 14 torpedoes that had plagued American submarines earlier in the war, with defective depth-keeping mechanisms and contact exploders that failed to detonate. By mid-1944, most of those problems had been solved through combat testing and field modifications. The electric torpedoes ran straight, ran deep when set properly, and exploded when they hit something solid. 4 fired electrically, running normally. Fire 5. O'Kane counted seconds in his head, calculating torpedo run time. 800 yards at 46 knots meant roughly 35 seconds from launch to impact. Tube 1 had fired 24 seconds ago. The first torpedo should be approaching the carrier's hull right about now. If everything worked perfectly, they'd hear explosions in the next 15 seconds. 5 fired electrically, running normally. Fire 6. Tang rocked slightly as her bow came up from the weight reduction. The torpedo officer immediately began flooding forward trim tanks to restore neutral buoyancy, maintaining their depth precisely at 150 feet. Too shallow, and they risked detection. Too deep, and controlling the submarine during the violent maneuvers coming after the attack would become difficult. 6 fired electrically, running normally. All tubes empty forward. Reloading in progress. O'Kane stepped back from the target data computer and checked his stopwatch. 38 seconds since Tube 1 fired. The first torpedo should have hit by now if the solution was correct. If they'd miscalculated somehow, all 6 weapons were running past the target into empty ocean, and Tang would have given away her position for nothing. Then the sound arrived. Not through the air, but through the water, transmitted through Tang's hull as vibration felt in your bones before your ears registered it. Wham! A deep, resonant explosion that rattled loose objects throughout the submarine. The crew froze, recognition dawning. That was a torpedo hit. That was metal tearing and bulkheads rupturing and seawater flooding into spaces designed to remain dry. Wham! Second hit. 4 seconds after the first, exactly the interval O'Kane had calculated for his spread. The sound was slightly different in character, maybe hitting a different section of the hull, encountering different internal structures as the explosion propagated through the target. Wham! Third hit. Murray Frazee was grinning now, his slide rule forgotten on the plotting table. 3 hits from 6 torpedoes was considered excellent shooting under any circumstances. 3 hits on a carrier from a single observation approach was unprecedented. Silence. 10 seconds passed. The 4th, 5th, and 6th torpedoes should be hitting, but the explosions had stopped. Either those weapons had missed, or they'd hit sections of the carrier already torn open by the first 3 detonations, their explosions masked by the cacophony of the ship breaking apart. O'Kane made the call. Up Periscope. Quick look. 2 seconds. The periscope rose. O'Kane caught it fast, his eye finding the carrier through muscle memory. What he saw exceeded his most optimistic projections. The carrier was listing heavily to port, maybe 15 degrees already and increasing. A massive column of black smoke rose from her midships section, where at least 2 torpedoes had struck nearly simultaneously. The flight deck was canted at an angle that made aircraft operations impossible. Crew members were visible abandoning ship, jumping from the listing deck into the water. 1 second. O'Kane swung the periscope to find the destroyers. Both were converging on Tang's position now, having finally located the source of the attack. The forward destroyer was turning hard, accelerating, white water visible at her bow as she built speed. Time to go. Down scope, rig for depth charge. Take her down to 300 feet. Full speed on the motors. Come right to heading 130. We're getting out of here, gentlemen. Tang's bow angled down sharply as the diving officer pushed the boat towards safer depths. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 300 feet would put them below the optimal depth charge settings the Japanese typically used, though a lucky hit could still crack their hull even at that depth. The electric motors accelerated to maximum output, pushing Tang away from the attack position at her best underwater. Speed of nearly 9 knots. Not fast enough to outrun destroyers, which could make 30 knots on the surface, but fast enough to complicate their targeting if Tang could stay quiet and make the escorts work for every sonar contact. The sound of the carrier breaking apart continued to reach them through the water, metal shrieking as structural supports failed under stress loads they were never designed to handle. Secondary explosions as fuel lines ruptured and aviation gasoline ignited. The carrier's magazines cooking off as fire reached ammunition storage spaces. Sonar reports destroyer screws bearing 020, closing fast. Second destroyer bearing 185, also closing. Estimate both contacts at 2,000 yards and decreasing. 2,000 yards meant the destroyers would be overhead in about 5 minutes at their current speed. O'Kane had 5 minutes to get Tang far enough away that the escort's sonar couldn't maintain solid contact. 5 minutes before the depth charging started. Level off at 300 feet. Maintain silent running protocols. No unnecessary noise. No equipment operations unless absolutely required. The crew shifted into silent running mode, a practiced routine where every man moved carefully to avoid creating sounds that might travel through the hull into the surrounding water. Conversations stopped. Foot traffic minimized. Equipment that could be shut down temporarily was secured. Tang became a ghost, drifting through the depths on minimal power, trying to disappear into the ocean's background noise. The destroyer screws grew louder, not the steady rhythm of ships on patrol, but the accelerating beat of vessels hunting aggressively, pinging active sonar in sweeps designed to locate submerged targets. The sound reached Tang as metallic pings that rang through the hull every few seconds. Ping. The sonar pulse hit Tang's hull and reflected back toward its source, telling the Japanese destroyer operator that something solid was down here, something big enough to produce a strong return, something that might be an American submarine. Ping. Closer now. The operator was refining his aim, narrowing the search cone, trying to establish exact range and depth. Modern sonar couldn't tell you everything about a submerged contact, but it could tell you enough to drop depth charges in the right neighborhood. O'Kane watched the depth gauge and speed indicator, calculating distances and angles in his head. Tang had covered maybe 1,000 yards since firing. Not enough. The destroyers were still too close, their sonar too accurate. Once the depth charges started falling, Tang would have to maneuver, and maneuvering meant making noise, and noise meant better sonar contacts, and better sonar contacts meant more accurately placed depth charges. It was a cycle that killed submarines if you couldn't break it. The first depth charge detonated at 800 feet behind Tang, far enough away that the Tang explosion was merely loud rather than destructive. Water transmitted shock waves efficiently, and even distant detonations could stun crew members, crack gauges, shatter light bulbs. But this one was a ranging shot, the destroyer's way of saying, "We know approximately where you are, now we're going to tighten the pattern." 3 more depth charges followed in quick succession, walking toward Tang's last known position. The destroyer captain was using a standard search pattern, dropping charges at intervals designed to cover the probable area where a submarine might be based on when sonar contact was lost. Smart tactics, proven tactics, tactics that had killed several American submarines already this war. But O'Kane had spent 2 years learning how to survive depth charge attacks. The key was knowing when to stay quiet and when to move. Stay still too long, and the destroyer's sonar would eventually locate you precisely. Move too early, and you gave away your position unnecessarily. The art was in timing the movement to coincide with explosions that would mask your propeller noise. "Stand by to change course," O'Kane ordered softly. "On my mark, come left to heading 090. Use the next depth charge detonation to cover our turn." The helmsman acknowledged with a hand signal rather than voice, maintaining silence. Seconds passed. Tang drifted forward at minimal speed, her electric motors barely turning. Another depth charge detonated, closer this time, maybe 500 feet. The submarine's hull rang like a bell. Cork insulation shook loose from the overhead, falling like snow. "Mark, come left." The helmsman spun the wheel. Tang's rudder bit the water, pushing her bow through a turn that would put them on a diverging course from the destroyer's search pattern. The maneuver created noise, the flow of water past the hull, changing pitch, but the depth charge explosion masked most of it. When the destroyer operator regained sonar contact, Tang would be somewhere unexpected, complicating the targeting solution. The pattern continued for 45 minutes. Depth charges falling at intervals, some close enough to shake paint off bulkheads, others distant enough to be merely ominous reminders that Tang was being hunted by professionals who knew their business. O'Kane maneuvered between detonations, changing course and speed in ways designed to present the most confusing sonar picture possible to the destroyer operators above. The Japanese were persistent and methodical, working a grid search pattern that would eventually cover every possible escape route if Tang couldn't slip through somehow. But persistence required fuel, and destroyers hunting submarines burned fuel at prodigious rates, running high-speed search patterns. The Japanese captain had to balance the value of sinking one American submarine against the fuel requirements for his primary mission, which was escorting what remained of the carrier force to the Marianas. At the 90-minute mark, the depth charging stopped. Not gradually, but suddenly. One moment the destroyers were actively prosecuting their attack. The next moment, silence. O'Kane waited, suspecting a trick, expecting the attack to resume once Tang's crew relaxed and made some small noise that would give away their position. But the silence extended. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The sonar operator reported destroyer screws receding, moving away at high speed rather than continuing the search. The Japanese had broken off the hunt. Tang had survived. O'Kane let himself breathe properly for the first time in 2 hours. Around him, the crew remained at stations, professional enough not to celebrate until their captain gave them permission. Secure from depth charge stations. Resume normal operations. Bring us up to periscope depth slowly. Let's see what's happening up there. Tang rose gradually, the diving officer nursing her up through the layers with practiced care. At periscope depth, O'Kane raised the scope and swept the horizon. The ocean was empty. No destroyers, no carrier. Just open water under an afternoon sun that revealed nothing about the violence that had occurred here hours earlier. He swept the periscope around full circle, looking for any sign of the Japanese formation. Found it. 10 miles distant and receding, 3 ships instead of 4. The carrier Tang had attacked was gone, either sunk completely or damaged so severely she'd separated from the formation and was limping back to base if she'd stayed afloat at all. The after-action report, O'Kane would write that evening, claimed 1 Japanese carrier sunk by torpedo attack, 3 hits observed, target left listing heavily and on fire. Intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor would later confirm the kill using decrypted Japanese naval communications. The carrier was Taiho, flagship of the 1st Carrier Strike Force, carrying Admiral Ozawa and his staff. 3 torpedoes had struck her midships, rupturing fuel tanks and starting fires that eventually ignited aviation gasoline vapors accumulating in her hangar deck. The crew had fought the damage for hours, but poor damage control decisions made the situation worse rather than better. Taiho sank that evening, taking 600 officers and men with her, including some of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots. The loss was catastrophic for Japanese naval aviation. Carriers could theoretically be replaced, though Japanese shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity. Experienced pilots couldn't be replaced at all. The training pipeline that had produced the elite aviators who'd attacked Pearl Harbor had been strangled by fuel shortages and accelerated combat losses. Every pilot who went down with Taiho represented thousands of hours of training that couldn't be regenerated. O'Kane's single observation firing technique had worked perfectly. 1 3-second periscope look, 35 seconds of blind approach, 6 torpedoes, fired at a target he couldn't see during the final attack phase. The result was a Japanese carrier sunk, and Tang undetected until after the torpedoes had hit. The technique violated every standard about maintaining visual contact during attack approaches, but it worked because O'Kane understood that mathematics could substitute for observation if your navigation was precise, and your crew trusted your calculations completely. The genius wasn't in the periscope trick itself. It was in recognizing that detection risk scaled exponentially with observation frequency, while firing accuracy scaled linearly with calculation precision. Reduce your observations to the absolute minimum, maximize your computational accuracy, and you could attack targets that traditional approaches couldn't reach, because those traditional methods exposed submarines too frequently to be survivable against alert escorts. Other submarine commanders heard about O'Kane's technique through informal channels, the network of patrol reports and ready room conversations where submarine captains shared what worked and what got people killed. Some tried to replicate it. Most found the method too demanding, requiring navigation skills and crew coordination beyond what could be achieved without extensive practice. The technique wasn't a magic solution that worked for everyone. It was a specialized tool that worked for O'Kane because he'd spent years developing the prerequisite skills and building a crew that could execute blind approaches with sufficient precision to matter. But the underlying principle spread through the submarine force anyway. Minimize detection opportunities. Trust your calculations. Attack from positions where enemy expectations said submarines couldn't operate. Those principles were universally applicable, even if the specific techniques varied by commander and crew capability. Tang's patrol continued for another 3 weeks. O'Kane used his single observation method twice more during that period, sinking a tanker and a destroyer with attacks that left their escorts confused about where the torpedoes had originated. By the time Tang returned to Pearl Harbor in July 1944, she'd sunk 5 confirmed ships and damaged 2 others, establishing herself as one of the most successful submarines in the Pacific Fleet. But success came with costs that wouldn't become apparent until later. The aggressive tactics O'Kane pioneered worked brilliantly against Japanese anti-submarine forces in mid-1944. Those same tactics would kill him and most of his crew 4 months later when a malfunctioning torpedo circled back and struck Tang, sinking her with 78 men trapped inside. The periscope trick that let O'Kane attack Taiho undetected couldn't save him from equipment failure, from the random mechanical malfunction that turned one of Tang's own torpedoes into the weapon that ended her war. But that's the nature of innovation in combat. You develop techniques that maximize your probability of success against enemy action. You can't defend against everything, and eventually probability catches up with everyone. The technique O'Kane developed lived on after Tang's loss. Post-war submarine doctrine incorporated single observation firing principles into standard training, though modified and refined based on additional combat experience. The nuclear submarines that emerged in the 1950s used passive sonar and computational fire control systems that eliminated periscope observations entirely for submerged attacks. Modern submarines attack targets they never see visually, relying entirely on sonar data and computer-calculated firing solutions. O'Kane would have understood that evolution perfectly. He'd been doing essentially the same thing with mechanical calculators and slide rules, trusting mathematics over visual confirmation because the mathematics were more reliable when you factored in detection risk. The 10. Battle of the Philippine Sea happened 2 days after O'Kane sank Taiho. American carrier aircraft destroyed what remained of Japanese carrier aviation in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese lost over 600 aircraft and pilots in a single day of combat, losses their training system couldn't replace. Combined with Taiho's sinking and the loss of another carrier, Shokaku, to submarine attack the same day, Japan's carrier capability was essentially eliminated as a strategic factor. The submarine force's contribution to that victory rarely received the attention given to the spectacular aerial combat, but the contribution was decisive. 2 carriers sunk by submarines before the air battle even started meant 2 carriers' worth of aircraft that never launched, never engaged American fighters, never threatened the invasion fleet at Saipan. The strategic impact of individual submarine attacks accumulated into advantages that shaped entire campaigns. O'Kane's Periscope trick was a small tactical innovation that enabled one specific attack on one specific target on one specific day. But that attack removed a Japanese flagship carrier from the war at a moment when Japan could least afford such losses. Small tactical innovations that produce strategic effects, individual actions that cascade into campaign-level consequences. That's how wars are won, one calculated risk at a time, one innovative technique at a time, one commander willing to try something different because the standard approach isn't working well enough. The stupid Periscope trick worked because O'Kane understood that every submarine tactic was a trade-off between competing risks. Traditional multi-observation approaches provided better target information but increased detection probability. His single observation method reduced target information but minimized detection risk. The question wasn't which approach was objectively better. The question was which trade-off optimized success probability against specific enemies in specific tactical situations. Against alert Japanese destroyers escorting high-value targets in mid-1944, minimizing detection risk was more important than maximizing target information because getting caught before firing meant zero probability of success, regardless of how good your target data was. O'Kane chose the trade-off that matched the tactical environment, and that choice sank a Japanese carrier. Different environments might demand different trade-offs. Against less alert escorts, traditional approaches might work better. Against targets in restricted waters where maneuvering room was limited, other techniques might be optimal. The genius was in recognizing that one-size-fits-all doctrine was inherently suboptimal, that creative commanders could develop specialized techniques for specialized situations. The Navy rewarded that creativity with medals and promotions, but also with something more valuable. They trusted commanders like O'Kane to make tactical decisions without micromanagement, to develop innovations without requiring approval from staff officers who'd never looked through a periscope in combat. That trust enabled the experimentation and rapid iteration that produced effective combat techniques faster than formal doctrine development could have achieved. Tang's crew called it a stupid periscope trick with affection and pride. Stupid because it seemed reckless to attack major warships based on 3-second observations. A trick because it worked through clever exploitation of enemy expectations rather than overwhelming force. But mostly they called it that because submariners have always used humor to process the terror of fighting a war in pressure hulls 300 feet underwater where mistakes kill everyone instantly. The technique wasn't stupid. It was calculated risk-taking based on accurate assessment of detection probabilities and firing solution requirements. It worked because O'Kane did the mathematics correctly and built a crew capable of executing complex maneuvers without visual reference to targets. That's not luck. That's competence applied creatively under conditions where standard competence wasn't sufficient. June 17, 1944. 3 seconds of periscope observation. 6 torpedoes fired blind. 1 Japanese carrier sunk, and a tactical innovation that proved sometimes the best way to see your target clearly is to barely look at it at all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.